All right, Alexander, let's answer all of the questions from the live stream that we did. Me and you, with a surprise guest appearance from Brian Berletic at the New Atlas. And let's begin with Elena, super sticker. Thank you very much, Elena, for that. Commando Crossfire says, Civil war for the soul of a nation. This is a struggle to save civilization. Demonstrations overthrown, the occupation, the annihilation of mental colonization.
I presume you're talking about the US.
Those are song lyrics.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay, I didn't know.
So, yeah.
Okay.
I think so, yeah. Joy Larson, thank you for that super chat. Stigma says, Kalispera, how about something stupid? Zelen in Slavic languages means the green one, male. How about Zelenskreen as a nickname? Serb from Greece. Thank you very much for that. You're correct. The Great says, anyone else find it odd that Pelosi goes to sleep at night with his phone charging in the bathroom instead of on the nightstand?
I think we touched on this during the video. Actually, I mean, I do find it strange. People do strange things. Let's not be. I mean, I'm sure I personally do things, all kinds of things, which others might find strange, but which don't seem at all strange to me. So I'm not going to comment on that further. Actually,
Maria, thank you for that super sticker. Ryan says, always great to see the live stream to discuss the news. We truly live in astonishing times. The more this madness goes on in multiple countries, the more I lose hope. The West is in full decline. Elvis says, the world will be a dark place without the Duran. I was just listening to Sky after many months. Nothing surprising, baffling, where Sky, BBC, other propaganda channels here in the UK get their facts.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think they know a lot of the facts, actually. But, of course, they're very selective in what facts they publish. And sometimes, well, let's be straightforward about it, they make their facts.
From Paul, will we find out who sabotaged Nord Stream?
Yes, eventually we will. This sort of thing, the truth always comes out in the end.
From Elza, good day, Alex and Alexander. Can you name 3 people you would like to have dinner with? We answered this one.
We answered that one.
Thank you very much for that, Elza. Virgo Rising says a few words on Christine Lagarde's comments about the inflation and her ad hominem attacks on Putin.
I think we touched on that too, actually, in the live stream.
Slav says, what is the probability that the EU and the US will descend into anarchy?
It's not. I mean, it's not impossible. I mean, one can't always predict what the outcome of a crisis is. But I have talked about systems collapse, and systems collapse can happen in societies. We've seen it happen. There's many historical examples of this. I will say this: periods of anarchy tend to be very short. When they take place, they're very frightening, but they don't usually last a very long time. But beyond that, what replaces them can be pretty ruthless, and that's perhaps what we should be more worried about in the longer term.
From Torontonian, thanks guys, it was amazing. Thank you for that, Torontonian. From Stephen G. If Russia was too big to sanction, what hope will we have trying to cut China off from the global economy? We need this madness to end.
We do need this madness to end. I will say one thing about China, which does make it different from Russia, which is, of course, that Russia is self-sufficient. I mean, it produces the energy, the food, the raw materials, all the things that it needs to keep ticking along. China is not self-sufficient in the same way. So, in theory, that could make it more vulnerable. In reality, of course, we are more independent. We were more interdependent, much more interdependent with China than we were with Russia. And of course, if we start an economic war of attrition with the Chinese, well, that is absolute folly and madness and could be disastrous. And of course, China and Russia together will, I mean, the Russians can provide the Chinese with the grain, the oil, the energy that they need, though one should not overlook the fact that at the present time, because these economic linkages are not yet fully developed, that could be quite difficult.
David S., thank you for that super sticker. Drasko Petric, thank you for that super chat. Commander Crossfire says, in your analysis, would Russia be able to restore the electricity and heating in Ukraine after reunification before the winter becomes deadly?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, if it comes to that, I mean, if there is a reunification, that's a big if. But assuming that happens, yes, absolutely they could. I've no doubt about it. I mean, there are basic compatibilities with the systems. I mean, they use the same electrical voltage, the same ultimate equipment. Yes, absolutely they could do it.
Dark Matters Falls says, obviously the government in the UK cannot run a bath. So who's behind them? Also, are we looking at a total collapse in the UK?
Well, I'm not talking about a total collapse. The Bank of England has said the worst recession since records began. I'm not sure when those records begin, by the way. I mean, nobody's told me so far. But it's a very, very grim economic picture. And one has to talk about this. One has to say that it is an accumulation of policy errors that go back a long way. I mean, it isn't just, we mustn't just put the finger on Sunak and Truss and Cameron and all, you know, Theresa May and all the Johnson and all these people, that they've obviously contributed to all of this. But I mean, it's a big, big fall from what we had before. And I just don't get the sense that the British political class has any idea what to do about it. So who's running things? Well, I think Britain, perhaps more than any other country, even including the United States, is very, very much controlled by globalist thinking and the people who run that.
From Branko, greetings from Serbia. Flight Gamer says, at the end of yesterday's Sky News video, they actually said if Russia could take Donbass and hold food over everyone's head in the winter, it would be a strong negotiating position. Wow.
Oh, yeah. You do get those, sometimes those glimmers of reality comes, you know, break through. But I mean, that doesn't always happen, of course.
From Rocky Lux, regarding the Alex Jones trials, didn't the false narratives originate from other sources and not from Jones, who repeated them?
I believe that's true. I mean, Robert Barnes is the person who knows about these things best. I mean, he's discussed them extensively on the videos, on the live streams we've done with him.
From Private R, British are stubborn AF. The economy has very little perspective. Despite all that, what do you think the best way for Britain to go forward apart from lifting sanctions?
I've discussed this many times. I think that firstly we have to get the sanctions lifted. We have to be open with our people about what we are, and then we've got to focus. The British government, British businesses have to focus on the world as it is, and they have to forge those trade agreements, and they may have to forge agreements with countries like China and Russia that we don't always like very much, and make the best of that and play to Britain's very considerable strengths. We are still an innovative and entrepreneurial country. We still have a lot we could do, but we're playing far below our game, because we are basically ideologically obsessed here. By the way, there's been some very disturbing stories now about Liz Truss and the time what she was focused on when she was Prime Minister, which is not the economy or the fact that people were quite obviously plotting against her. Apparently, she was entirely focused on the war in Ukraine. I mean, that was what was taking up all her time, and worries about radioactive contamination if the Russians exploded a nuclear device and that kind of thing. So, I mean, very weird things. And I think she's just an extreme case of the mindset of our political class. They need to stop thinking in these weird ways and start focusing instead on the real problems that Britain has.
Mama Alaska says, 2014 overthrow of Ukraine, 2016 Clinton loses to Trump, starts Russiagate as a psyop on Collective West. Clinton not was to be the first woman POTUS, but to take down Putin. It won't matter who is in power.
I think that's a lot of truth in this. I've always said that one of the fundamental reasons the neocons and people like them became so furious with the election outcome in 2016 was that they were already very heavily focused on regime change in Moscow. And of course, Hillary Clinton was fully signed up to all of that. And then along comes Donald Trump, who says, far from seeking regime change in Moscow, I want to sit down with Putin and come to a good accommodation with him. So I think that that is true. And I mean, if you remember the 2016 election, as I do, right on the eve of it, there was this extraordinary letter from members of the State Department basically criticising Obama for being too soft and saying that we needed a president who would take a much stronger line. And it wasn't very difficult to work out a stronger line against whom. So I think there is a lot of truth to that. And I don't say that's the whole story of Russiagate, but I think it's a significant part of it.
Alvamation says good morning to all the Duran audience. Matriputra says, as I watch the Western leaders in a seeming suicide pact, I keep thinking those whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. Thank you for that.
I think we discussed that.
Colberry says,
Euripides, apparently.
Colberry says, do you think they'll escalate with Belarus? P.S. Thanks for your work.
Well, anything is possible. I mean, the Russians are there. And I think that if they start escalating with Belarus, what do you mean by escalating? Trying another colour revolution attempt? I've been in touch with some people in Belarus. It doesn't seem to be the mood for that at all at the moment. So I think that would be stillborn. But a military invasion? Well, I think that would have disastrous consequences. But, these people, as I've said many times, have no reverse gear. So it's entirely possible they could try something like that.
Arctic Lord says, I have to ask, if Putin comes for Canada and the UK land, how much of it are you willing to give up to appease him, to maintain the peace?
None is the short answer. And of course, that question doesn't exist because he's never shown the slightest interest either in British or Canadian land. I mean, let's not indulge in imaginary scenarios which have no relation to the realities that we face.
Jen Judy, thank you for that super chat. Moondragon says, looking at this special operation, it seems to me that it's not only aimed at Ukraine, but the entire West.
Yeah, I think we discussed this in the program, actually. I think that is. I said I don't think that was the intention at the start, but it has evolved into that over time.
iComment Live says, guys, your views on Andrew Tate. He loves Putin and became Muslim. Google him. Secondly, he is open to be a guest in your podcast. Can you send him an invite? And he bought a Bugatti.
I'll be interested. I don't know anything about this man. Yes. I don't know anything about this person. I mean, I should make it very clear. I mean, I don't love Putin. I mean, I find him an interesting political leader. But, at the Duran, we cover political leaders as they are. And, he is an interesting leader. He's got much to say, as he showed at the Valdai speech that he gave last week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's about Andrew Tate to have him on the show.
Yeah, I know. I mean, let's have him on. Absolutely, yes.
Andrew Tate, I think this is a troll, to be honest. But that would be great.
That is my own view, which is why I made that particular observation.
Thank you. I comment live. Interesting questions. Dan says, what are your thoughts on India's future place in East-West relations, especially in light of its plans for the international North-South transport corridor?
Yes, I think India is steadily now emerging as an independent great power. I think there was a brief period when the Modi government tilted perhaps too heavily towards the US. I think, like so many other people, they've looked at the Biden administration and let's say that they're not impressed by what they see. So at the moment, they're playing an independent game. They've got this good relationship with Russia, which they're obviously not prepared to sacrifice. And at the same time, they do have complicated relations with China to work out. But as I said, they've played their very considerable and very strong cards with great skill, and I think they will continue to do that. And they will become stronger.
Ariman, thank you for that super chat. A.R. Frances says, please talk more about the mental derangement you mentioned. When did it start?
Well, good question. I think that things began to go badly wrong during the Clinton years. I mean, that was when we started to get ideas like, liberal humanitarianism. Tony Blair gave that extraordinary speech in Chicago in which he talked about the end of the Westphalian system and about, the right of countries to intervene in other countries, humanitarian interventionism, R2P and all that, right to protect, and also that was really the start of the whole rule-based order idea. And of course, it was also it was during that administration that the agreement with Russia that NATO would not be extended eastwards, that was made at the end of the Cold War, was broken. So I would say that was the moment, that is the period in the 1990s, particularly the second half of the Clinton administration, when things began to go wrong.
Jaideep says, will Europe be able to freeze and seize the 300 billion in Russian frozen assets for Ukraine redevelopment? How should Russia respond?
We've talked about this many times. Yes, of course they will. I mean, they will. I don't know whether it'll go to Ukrainian redevelopment. That's another story completely. But they will seize those assets. I mean, and the fact that there may be legal issues about doing that, well, they've shown repeatedly that they're not worried about legal issues. So, of course, that's what they're going to do. I've no doubt about it at all. And what will the Russians do? I think that the Russians have written that money off. I think that they realise that for them to do something about it would be, over and above all the many things that they're doing now, would be hopeless. And I think they'll just stick to their present policies and write off that money and never, ever involve themselves in the Western financial system ever again.
Asmi06 says, Putin has spoken recently about two Wests. I was surprised how many Westerners agree with that sentiment among my acquaintances. Have you observed anything like that, and what are your thoughts?
Oh, I haven't, because most Westerners I know are completely unfamiliar with Putin's Valdai speech. When you point it out to them, I mean, people are interested, but up to that point, and I mean, amongst my own circle of acquaintances, people I know, nobody knows about this. Nobody knows about what he said in that speech in Valdai and about him talking about the two Wests. This isn't something, as I said, that most people know. I think some people, especially in the United States, on the conservative wing of politics in the United States, who are more willing to listen and who take a more, shall we say, self-confident view of world affairs, they are aware of what Putin said, and you can see that it is gaining traction among some of them. But in Europe, I have to tell you, Putin might as well have been speaking into empty air, and I just don't think anybody here of any consequence, and certainly no one I know, has paid any attention to it or is even aware of it.
Angry Wahawk says, Alex, how did you get an American accent?
I didn't notice that you had one, Alex, but I mean, you've lived there. How did I get a British accent?
CC says, as much as I admire Putin and hate the U.S. elite, I think it's rather naive to frame this as good versus evil. Do you not see globalist forces without borders behind this? China's model being the future blueprint.
Well, first of all, I detest any attempt to reduce everything to good against evil-ish narratives. That's what the other side does. I think that is a complete misuse of that kind of language. So I mean, if one side is evil, does that mean that the other side is perfectly good? So I mean, this isn't the kind of language that we ever use on the Duran. I do think that there are some people in the West, globalists and people like that, who are pursuing very sinister policies and have very sinister intentions, which will have evil consequences. And to the extent that the Russians are standing in the way of that, well, you could say that, you know, they're acting as a resistant to what are undoubtedly evil forces. But this is not a rhetoric, a language that I use. Will we get into a system like China? No, I don't think so. I don't think that is where we're heading. And I don't think the globalists in the West actually quite conceive of the world in that way. I think in some ways they want to go much further than the Chinese do. For one thing, the Chinese are pragmatic, whereas these people are deeply ideological. If you want to compare it with any kind of China, compare it with Mao's China, not today's.
Joint OSRS says, have you been working out, Alexander? Looking good.
Oh yeah, I mean I do work out. I go to the gym twice a week. It's about the one thing I do when I'm not working because one has to. But well, thank you for your kind words.
MDE says, thinking about economic attrition from the West, I believe the West was forced to turn the faucet off as much as possible to stifle Russia's economy as much as possible. Open economy would give Russia full momentum. Thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, and the Russians talk about this all the time. They say, and by the way, they say that this has been a problem they've been facing ever since the middle period of the Cold War. People are not aware of this, but one of the reasons the Russians, the Soviets, went so big for détente was that, I mean, there was a lot of talk at that time. This is, you know, we're going back to the 60s within the Soviet Union about, you know, changes to the economy, opening up the Soviet Union a bit to the international system. There was, even as I remember, you know, my memory goes back far, plans to enter into a deal with Lockheed to build Lockheed's TriStars. This is a wide-body jet in Voronezh, in a city in Voronezh in Russia. And of course what then happened was that the West came along, the United States came along, there was the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, all that was stopped, and there was an attempt to basically restrict Russia's economic development in that way. And then of course the Soviet Union went, the Russians again tried to rejoin the international system, and again, almost immediately as their economy started to come together and as they ceased to conceive of themselves as simply a raw material supplier, you started to see things begin to happen. You saw the very first sanctions, which people don't know about or think about much, were about the Magnitsky affair, believe it or not. And that, of course, placed Russia on the sanctions escalator. And the Russians repeatedly say that the purpose of all of this is to stifle the development of their economy. It was a major theme of Putin's Valdai speech.
From Island People, thank you both for the work you do. Hearing you sane voices helps prevent me from becoming completely cynical. That being said, is the best hope for peace the West's collapse?
I would like to think otherwise. I mean, you know, there's a part of me that still hopes for that Western leader, probably in the United States. Well, in practical terms, it can only be the United States who will understand where American interests truly lie and will start to pursue rational foreign policies based on American self-interest. But I have to admit this, I'm becoming less optimistic about that with almost every day that passes. And this administration, I won't say that it's brought me to the point of despair, but it's not that would not be far off from the truth.
Jeff Bickford, thank you for that super chat. Red Pill Scholar says, God bless you. God bless both of you for your invaluable efforts. Thank you for that. Claudia Vivarelli says, what about dinner with Georgia Maloney? Talked about
Yeah,
that. Thank you very
we
much,
discussed that, I
Claudia.
think.
RD RD Patterson says freezer and seizure seems to be the plan. Correct. RD Patterson. Shaura Shikar says you have to give it to Blinken, the only point person he could find in the whole British intelligence to coordinate the attacks on Nord Stream was Liz Truss. Haha, Liz Truss could have been kept out of this.
Well, bear in mind, she was the
Gre-
Foreign Secretary and then the Prime Minister, so, I mean, she would have been in the loop. And I wouldn't be surprised if she was involved, actually, despite the fact that, as I think Brian said, she's not the sharpest knife in the drawer, and that's putting it mildly.
Kripaland says, I think my dog enjoys the Duran as much as I do. Every time he hears your voice, he runs into the room and settles in my lap for the entire live stream.
Ah, lovely.
Thank you for that. Mark Hewitt says, what do you think of Robert Jenrick's comments this morning attacking his boss, Suella Braverman?
No, I haven't followed this story. I mean, there's clearly an attempt to destabilise, to remove Suella Braverman from the office of Home Secretary. And I'm going to say straight away, I strongly suspect that part of the group that's trying to remove Braverman from the office of Home Secretary is Rishi Sunak's group. I know that sounds bizarre, given that he's just appointed her to that post, but it's, I think, fairly well known that they don't particularly get on, and he basically took her on in order to win her support against Johnson, and now, of course, that Johnson's out of the way, she's become dispensable. So I think that there's quite a lot going on, and I don't find it surprising that all sorts of people are coming out and briefing against her.
Shwada Shikar says, you guys are talking about Maloney. She seems to be a massive disappointment.
Well, so far. But, you know, let's give her time. I mean, she's not yet even Prime Minister of Italy, so let's see what she does.
Daniela says, thank you. Thank you, Daniela, for that. Tired Student says, love from Singapore. Thank you. Bella says, do illegal things in a legal way, squaring the circle.
Absolutely. Doing illegal things in a legal way. Of course, you can't. That's a contradiction in terms. But you can do them in a legalistic way. You can pretend that what you're doing is according to the law. You can follow all kinds of rituals and formulas, which of course empty them of their true meaning and purpose. And I think we've seen far too much of that, both in the United States and in Britain. We saw it during the Assange proceedings, for example. And I'm afraid that's what we're going to see again.
Slav says, U.S. studying how to get viruses to only attack Russian genetic and how to distribute such virus like using birds as carriers that only migrate to Russia. Horrifying, and it's barely mentioned.
Well, it is horrifying, and it's so barely mentioned. I must admit, I missed it. I mean, if it's happening, and it wouldn't surprise me, because as I said, anything seems possible nowadays, then it is absolutely horrifying, and it is appalling and immoral and profoundly wrong. And by the way, it also contradicts all sorts of treaties and commitments that have been made by the United States. All I will say about that is horrifying, immoral, wrong. I haven't seen it confirmed. If it is really being planned, every attempt to devise a weapon like that has up to now been a failure, and I expect that this one will be too. By a failure, I don't mean that it wouldn't be extremely dangerous, but the idea that you can only target one population and not the entire human population is reckless.
Hi to all from PJM. Brian is not wearing a tie. Not sure that is acceptable. Joke. When we are talking about the deep state, do we have a king in charge of everything, or what are we talking about?
No, we're not talking about kings. We're talking about various very powerful people who come together and discuss things and who believe that they have a right to control and run things, and that politicians and people like that are there. Basically, elected politicians are just a nuisance who should do as they're told. I mean, that is what a deep state is. In other words, it's the permanent national security bureaucracy of a country and part of its civilian bureaucracy as well. The people who conceive of themselves as the permanent government of their country, and who've now, in some countries in the West, come to see themselves as the actual government of their countries.
From Carrie C. Seems as if part of Ukraine is more pro-Polish, the other East-South Russia in a rational pro-peace world. Ukraine would be at least two separate countries. Thoughts?
I once upon a time, years ago, I came round to that view myself. This was before the Maidan events. I said that these two parts of Ukraine are so different from each other and so much in opposition to each other that the only real way of solving the Ukrainian crisis, which is already beginning to fester, this is before Maidan, was through partition. But of course it didn't happen. And nobody apparently wanted it. And of course the West has rejected it outright and continues to insist on a single Ukraine with the East, the pro-Russian East, subordinated to the West. And basically, if those people who live there leave, well, they won't be sorry.
Aidan Daniels, in your guys' opinion, how long does Sunak have in number 10?
I've put it at about a year. Now, he might be able to drag it on for another year beyond that to the election. The only thing that might prolong it even further is the dismal performance of Keir Starmer, who has looked very unconvincing over the last couple of weeks.
M. Khan Black says, the lunatics have the keys. Society succeeds when old men plant trees of whose shade they shall never sit. Those who would make you believe in absurdities would make you commit atrocities. From Voltaire.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. Excellent.
Hunger the Die Merchant says, we talk about how Asian countries are obsessed with saving face. There is no entity more obsessed with face than the West USG. To negotiate with your enemies is a humiliation in their eyes.
Completely true.
Tired Student says, what Western politicians don't seem to realize is that every time they bash China, they anger a whole group of people in Southeast Asia with ancestry from China as well.
True enough. I've encountered this in Britain. There's a big Chinese community here, and many of them have issues with the Chinese government. I mean, it's a misconception to think of them as all pro the government in Beijing, but they're increasingly seeing a lot of the criticisms that are being made as criticisms of China as a whole, a China in whose rise they've taken a great deal of pride, and you can see that they're becoming increasingly angry as well. I know a lot of Chinese people in London.
From Leon Jacob, thank you for that super sticker. From Charlie Emsis, remember a doc called Zeitgeist from 2007? It's a must-watch. Well-made, well-sourced, and shows the West has been engineering the crisis we face for at least 20 years. I cannot recommend it enough.
Okay, this is a film, I presume. I haven't seen it.
Evans, thank you for that super sticker. Pasha Moyer says, what is it that allows people to make these self-destructive choices when even a moment of self-reflection would disabuse them of those choices?
Well, that is a huge question. It's psychology, and I'm not a psychologist. All I will say is this: a fanaticism, ideological fanaticism, in one form or another, has existed throughout the ages. And we're going through a particularly dangerous period of it today. And I'm going to say this also. I think that the collapse of religion, traditional religion in the West, has also played a role, because with it gone, all sorts of morbid ideas and cultic ideas have taken its place too. And that has reinforced the trend towards irrationality.
From Mech1164, you have to ask to what end. None of this is going to hurt BRICS or China, Russia. What's the bigger agenda the puppets of the collective West want?
Well, I think that at one level they do think they probably still think that they can hurt China and Russia and secure the hegemony of the West. If you read newspapers and the kind of places I read, some of them which are very difficult to read, by the way, but if you do, go to the Atlantic or read the Atlantic Council, different organs, by the way, their website. I mean, it's all about preserving the hegemony of the West, pushing down, destroying the challenge that's coming from Eurasia. And of course, that was what Putin's speech at Valdai was all about, looking at it from the other side. But if they can't achieve that, I think it's coming back to something Alex said in a video we did a while ago. What they will do, their plan B, is that they will retreat to their core region, Europe, the United States, North America, perhaps parts of Central and South America, and they will try to establish their control and their kind of utopian vision there.
Taffy4 says Diane Sarah was great, thanks. Thank you for that. Radovid, thank you for that super chat. At large 47, thank you for that super sticker. Paulie says, I'm not allowed to send you the message I wanted. Thank you very much for that, Paulie. Sparky says, the West can save effort by using Juan Guaido as Russia's leader in exile.
We talked about that.
Thank you for that. Jeffrey Rock says, I missed who this is, but I agree with this belief that they're rushing. I think coup wasn't planned, but they thought they could have enough pieces in place that they could use it to push their timetable up.
Absolutely, that's exactly what they were doing. And I mean, I think that there is a kind of urgency about what's going on, what they're trying to do, which is in itself very dangerous. Mm-hmm.
From Shiva Varan says, it's done. You're right. They can't help themselves but to brag.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Lover of the Russian team, thank you for that super chat. Graham Murray says, gravity model of trade interaction identifies what U.S. needs to target to move trade away from rivals. Edward Ullman on Wikipedia. Katie Miggs says, maybe Russia should arrange regime change in Poland.
The Russians would have no idea how to do that. Impossible for them to do. They don't have the contacts in Poland. They don't have the people in Poland that they could work with, and they don't have the institutions to carry out regime change. And the last time Russia carried out regime change, to my knowledge, I mean, it sounds extraordinary to say this, but I mean, you have to go back to the 1940s when, Stalin and his henchmen were changing regimes in Eastern Europe, 40s and early 50s. I don't think you'll find that they've been very successful whenever they've tried to do it anywhere since.
From Semsoto to Alexandros, from one Brian, an unsurpassable All Saints team.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Vincent says, it is one way in the EU. We have nowhere to turn.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's how they want it to be.
Tatiana Carmichael, thank you for that super sticker. Tempest123, thank you for that super chat. Sparky says, I speculated Liz Truss took it upon herself to go forward with the sabotage of Nord Stream, and that's why she's no longer PM, even as a placeholder.
I think more likely, much more likely, if you want to look for a geopolitical reason behind this, and I want to stress again, I personally think that the plot was hatched in Britain. I mean, she had lots of enemies here, and the whole Truss Kwarteng grouping had a lot of enemies here within the Remainer establishment. But putting that aside, if you want to look for an external dimension to this, it was the revelation that she was leaking, that she was using a phone, and that third parties could listen to what she was saying and or read what she was writing. And I think that will have incensed the US, at least the deep state in the US, considerably, and that's putting it mildly.
Mark Ackman, thank you for that super sticker. Andrew Pinar, thank you for that super chat. Tyler Durden says, thanks, guys. Commander Crossfire says, I would say it's not so much hybrid war, but modern warfare. This is how wars in the modern age between nuclear superpowers are waged, the second stage of the Cold War. This is the invisible war.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that is true. I think that in a kind of a way, it's almost a good thing. It's not kinetic war anymore between the great powers, but of course the danger with that is that it can always spiral out of control. And these troop deployments, for example, that the United States is now making in Ukraine, are a potential example of that.
From Eugene Hung, the CCP does not intend mutual cooperation. Their own documents indicate their interest as the new hegemon.
I don't agree with that. I mean, I've read them, I have to say. And maybe they have some other intention, but I didn't see anywhere in the documents that came out of the party congress, for example, anything like that at all. My impression, on the contrary, is of a government that is very, very well aware that it's having to deal with enormous problems within China itself.
From Commando Crossfire. Oh no, wait, I read that. From Fox 232. When you centralize management of cell phones in some organization, there is no reason to attack each device. They likely went for management servers, which usually have lower security than phones.
This is, I presume, about Britain. I mean, for all I know, that's absolutely correct. I don't know very much about these sort of things, but I'm sure what you're saying is right.
Robin R. says, Bonjour, monsieur. Thank you for that, Robin R. Mac Andrzejak says, can you recommend a news service with current world news that's trustworthy? I used to watch Fox and Newsmax and sometimes Wyon, but feel those are iffy now.
To be honest, I don't know of a single news service that is entirely objective and impartial. I mean, is it even possible for that to be the case in the world that we have today? This world of extreme dividing lines and hostility between great powers. What I try to do is go to all of them, and I read what each of them says, and I try to get a clear picture. And quite often, it's not difficult to do that. I mean, either they're talking about the same things, they're from different perspectives, or one is talking about something and the other isn't, and that in itself is often quite indicative of things. It's much more time-consuming, far more labour-consuming, but that's the only way I can see of doing it now.
MB, thank you for that super sticker. Sabrin Nalisan says thank you. Sharaniquid Kidney says super chat, thank you. Puppet Masters Fool says thank you, guys. Thank you. John Flanders says you help keep us sane. Keep up the great work. And Brent Zeller says the U.S. is based on a competitive model. We are programmed to see others as obstacles to our goals. You can't cooperate when you've been taught to compete. Evolutionary education beyond competition.
I don't completely. I understand that's a point you often hear made about the United States, but I can't fully accept that. I think. I mean, I remember other times in U.S. history where the U.S. showed great ability to compete, to cooperate with other powers. And if you go back to, the sort of heyday for me of U.S. foreign policy, which is the period basically from the 1860s until the Second World War, at least, until the World Wars, I mean, the policy of the United States for much of that period and during the interwar years as well was to seek cooperation. American lawyers, for example, American jurists, were the people who systematized international law. And they did that with conceptions completely different from the ones you hear now.
Paul Dorofoyev says, how bad do you think the inflation is in Ukraine? They report around 20% per year over year, but I think that is massaged. Can a complete monetary collapse, hyperinflation, end the war sooner?
I think that's entirely correct. I'm not going to try and guess what it actually is. I saw a figure that it's running at 30% a month, which I'm sure is far too high. We've had a report from someone in Ukraine, I'm not going to discuss who, but he says that food prices, or at least prices of basic staples, have been steady. I think the government is trying very hard to keep them that way. But of course, you can only do that up to a certain point. I don't know what the true rate of inflation is in Ukraine, but clearly things are under growing pressure.
Sparky says, Western elite leaders don't learn from their mistakes, instead convincing themselves failure couldn't be helped, since they're the best and brightest.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Denitsa Ivanova says, the USSR even back then had cheap energy. The new iron curtain certainly does not.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that. Envy Storm says, this is the first time I feel like I'm on the wrong side of history. Being in the West, it's like staring in a mirror and not liking what you see.
A lot of people are in denial about this. I mean, people in the West have become so accustomed to believing that they are on the right side of history that for them to start saying to themselves that, you know, we're no longer on the right side of history is more than many people can accept or understand, and that's one of the great problems.
Ken Surplus says, for anyone interested in Russian production and military industry, check out the combat approved program available in English on YouTube.
Yeah, I've seen it from time to time. I would say that please do be aware if you go to combat approved, which has its points. It's good points, and it shows you all sorts of interesting machines from time to time. But do be aware that it is basically run by the Russian Ministry of Defense. So, inevitably, they're not going to criticize their own products or their own systems. But, you do get quite a lot of idea of what they do, and you get a sight of the interiors of Russian factories, for example, and things of that sort.
Ralph Peterson says, your measured, learned perspectives are a breath of fresh air. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Joanna, thank you for that super sticker. Sparky says, America has been deindustrialized. It may take time before the weapons given to Ukraine can be replaced. Just-in-time inventory gone wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, Brian Berletic has been the great, explainer of all of this, if I may say.
From Rotor October, thank you guys, all three of you. You guys should have a program in public TV and reach millions. You three and Garland Nixon should get together on these shows more often. Keep up the good work.
We'd love to have Garland on again, actually. But, the day on mainstream television, well, there may be a revolution somewhere one day. Something like that may happen, but then I'm not holding my breath.
Farshir, thank you for that super chat. Sharon Kidney says, thanks guys for everything you all do. Sparky says, many younger Americans don't know one end of the screwdriver from the other, but they can tell you if it's sexist, racist, or homophobic.
I think there's some truth in that. I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, bear in mind, my wife is an academic, and, she mixes with people in the student world. And I think this is obviously in Britain. And I mean, not all students by any means are like this. Not all young people by any means are like this. But I mean, she has come across attitudes which are pretty much as strange as you say.
John Morgan, thank you for that super sticker. Sparky says, God bless Brian too. Mr. Wonderful says, the key question is if the West dares to try and fill the vacuum when Ukraine totally collapses.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a very big question. And can I just, by the way, suggest Alex has done a good video on this again on his channel. I mean, go to it. You'll see that he talks about boots on the ground and all that.
Island Popsicle says, things will get worse before they get better, and we'll be feeling the consequences of the West's hubris for decades. But at least we'll have the Duran to guide us through. May God bless you both.
Thank you very much for those kind words.
And on that note, we are finished with this Q&A session. Thank you very much, everybody.